You're listening to the Think Grow podcast.
I study the patterns of the universe.
Advancement to the brain.
Virtual your mind. Talking about your life. Fundamental principles.
Philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
Those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Think Grow podcast, where personal development meets real life. I'm your host, Ruben Chavez, and I explore a variety of topics with thought leaders, creators, scientists, entrepreneurs, all sorts of interesting people, with the goal to bring you different perspectives you can use to enrich your mind and improve your life in whatever way you see fit. In this episode, I sit down with my wife and business partner, Vanessa, and we talk about a subject that has been on my mind lately, and that is personality psychology. And she has informed me that this is not a very sexy topic, and I can see how that might be the case, but my goal with this episode is to make it more accessible to you guys and show you why it's important. Vanessa was really helpful in doing that, I think. She has been a coach in some capacity for a little over a decade at this point. She has been a coach in the corporate environment. She has been a health and nutritional consultant, and she currently consults with people about business strategy and social media and things like that. So she is a really good resource because she knows people very well. She's very good at identifying traits, and she's very compassionate, which is a personality trait that we'll talk about. But in addition to that, she also helps me develop my own ideas. So she was a really helpful person to have with me while I kind of explain this framework. And the framework that I talk about is the Big Five personality model. And it's the most researched personality model that we have right now. And it's the most robust framework that we have to explain and describe people's personalities. So the main thing that I am excited about in this episode is drawing the connection between personality psychology and personal development. This is a connection that I made very recently, and I wanted to share it with you all because I think it's very important. One of my favorite things to do is to make connections between different fields of study. And when I figured out how personal development intersects with personality psychology, it made me very happy. This is something that we discuss in the episode, but the basic idea is that personality psychology describes the aspects about yourself that make you who you are. Those traits that we care about and the traits that are noticeable to other people and to yourself. And personal development is essentially the art and the practice of developing those traits. And the reason this is important is because when you are able to identify the specific personality trait that you need to work on, you then have a sort of customized approach to personal development. And then you can identify the books and the resources that are most going to help you. So this is a running theme throughout the episode, and hopefully this is as interesting to you as it is to me. If you want to read the blog post I wrote about this topic, you can head over to my blog at thinkgrowprosper.com, and I've also written about it on my Instagram page at thinkgrowprosper. So if you have any questions or suggestions or feedback about this episode, feel free to drop me a comment at either one of those places, or you can leave me a review on iTunes. That's always appreciated. Something that I want to recommend to you is while you're listening to this episode and while you're listening to us discuss these different personality traits, think of people who you know that exhibit these traits. That's going to help make these ideas more real for you, and it's going to help anchor these traits in something concrete, something you can relate to. So think of people who you know that exhibit the traits that we talk about in the episode, and that's really going to help you digest this content a little better. So without further delay, here is the conversation between myself and Vanessa about the psychology of personality. So, I want to talk about personality. This is a subject I've been talking about a lot lately. If you've been following my 100-Day Project on Instagram or on the blog. And it's something that I've been fascinated by and I'm just interested in for a variety of reasons. I started out with some basic questions, like what is personality? What are the different personality traits? Why are they traits? What impact do they have on our lives?
Yeah.
These kind of things. And I wrote a blog post, but I wanted to kind of make it more accessible and you help with examples and develop my ideas. And so I think we should talk about personality. What do you think?
I agree. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Sometimes Vanessa does this radio host voice, and it's very funny, but it's not really her voice.
It is my voice.
No, it's not.
Okay, he's talking. This is my voice. My radio voice is when I say something that sounds like you're listening to the Think Grow podcast. But both are very pleasant.
I love them both. Okay, so what do you want to know?
What do you want to tell me? I think, so the way this episode came to be was Ruben and I were discussing personality, psychology, and its relationship to personal development. Personal development is really the foundation of Think Grow Prosper and Think Grow Podcast. And Think Grow Podcast is our way, your way of evolving and seeing like the actual application of personal development. So I think talking about the relationship with how does personality psychology apply to personal development? What's their relationship?
Exactly, yeah. And that's a really important point for me. It was a really important connection for me to make, actually, because I didn't start studying personality psychology with the intention that it was going to apply directly to personal development necessarily. But it ended up fitting right in with it. And I'll go over how that works shortly here.
I think it's important to just kind of the conclusion that we came to, which is that personal development is really just the practice and the study and the art of developing facets of your personality. So if you want to be more disciplined and focused, there is a personal development book out there for that. If you need to be more mindful, there's, something for that. And all of those can actually attach to this Big Five framework that we're going to get into today.
Yes, exactly.
So,
that's a good intro. That's a very good, you laid the foundation very well there. And we'll fill that in after we discuss the personality framework here. Like I said, I've been interested in personality for a while, and many of you may have taken different personality assessments. Myers-Briggs is a popular one. Enneagram is another popular one, and you introduced me to both of those, I believe. And these are really cool ways to kind of understand yourself and understand other people too. Because what I found fascinating with some of these personality assessments was that like some question would be so obvious to you, like that you would answer a certain way. But then especially if you were taking them with someone else, that person would be like, oh my God, did you see this question? Like, how could anybody answer it in the way that you did, right? Like, yeah. And so it's so funny to me, and that just illustrates how different people think.
Totally. And like, something to know about me is that if personal development is Ruben's first love, personality psychology is my first love. Like, starting many years ago in high school even, I had the Enneagram book or the Myers-Briggs book or all of these different frameworks. And my party trick, it's going to sound like it was really fun to go to parties with me, would be to have people take these assessments and look at these books and be like, oh, this is because you were a 4 in the Enneagram, or this. And we've done that actually with friends and family when we've had dinner parties. And it's just a really interesting way of understanding others better and understanding your relationship and your dynamics better too.
Yeah, I agree. And more recently, I've been studying a framework called the Big Five personality model. And that has been studied since the 60s, and it has the most research behind it. It has the most data, it has the most studies, and it's the most robust framework that we have and that psychologists have come up with to explain and describe individual personality traits. It's much more nuanced than personality frameworks that you might be familiar with. But it's called the Big Five. And by the way, we're using this word framework a lot, and I really like the word framework because I think of it as a lens through which you can view something. And so that's why we're calling this a framework. It's actually a taxonomy, which means it's a way to classify different things, and in this case, traits. And so the way it does that is primarily through language, which I think is really interesting. And so it's called the Big Five because it's based on 5 main traits. And you're like, well, humans are more complex than 5 traits. Why would it just cover 5 traits? And the answer is because it turns out that although there are a lot of different ways to describe someone's personality or different aspects of personality, a lot of those are synonyms for each other, right? So if you describe someone as, happy-go-lucky and talkative and gregarious and outgoing, you're describing a particular quality of a person, and it just so happens in this example, that quality would be extraversion, which is your inclination to be more social and hang out with people and seek social interactions, something like that. Okay, so what are the 5 different traits? 5 different traits, you can remember them with the acronym OCEAN. OCEAN. And we're actually going to go a little bit out of order when I describe them because I think it's important to go in a particular order. But the OCEAN acronym stands for O, which is openness to experience, C, conscientiousness, E, extraversion, A, agreeableness, and N, neuroticism. Okay, so let's unpack these. Let's start with E, extraversion. What is extroversion? This is probably the personality trait that we're all most familiar with, right? We've all heard the term introvert and extrovert, and we have kind of an intuitive understanding about what it is.
And even if you don't, even if you haven't heard the term extroversion or introversion, extroversion is you're extra. The more extroverted you are, the more extra you are. And then introverted is you're more focused inwardly. Something that you didn't mention that I just think is helpful is that all of these are measured on a spectrum. And so let's say the spectrum, it's like 0 to 100. So you can be, if you're 100, that's when you're real extra. Or you can be 0, which means you are fairly introverted. And so for me, that's really helpful to understand the balance.
That's very helpful. That's actually a really good point. And something that I definitely laid out in the blog post I wrote about this, just in case you're a reader and not a listener, go read the blog post because all the details there. But
I hope you're both if you're listening to the podcast.
True, but so yeah, it's on a spectrum, and that's actually what gives this framework so much nuance, is that there's not just like 16 personality types, there's like a whole spectrum on each individual personality trait. Think of it as like a mixing board, if you're an audiophile, an audio engineer, or if you've ever seen a mixing board, you can turn up different dials and turn down different ones, and the combination of that is going to determine how the end result sounds. And a personality is going to determine how you are, what kind of a person you are. Yeah.
Another example would be I'm not an audiophile and I don't know much about mixing boards. Therefore, I think of it like a recipe. If you're lower in this trait, maybe you're going to be saltier.
Yes, it's a recipe.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you. See, that's a perfect example of why you're here. Okay, so one other point. All these traits... So all these traits are indicated by one trait. They're represented by one trait. But they, like you said, represent the spectrum. So when we say extroversion, we're also implicitly talking about introversion. Mm-hmm. It's the other end of the spectrum, right? And so it's this introversion-extroversion spectrum. And people who are more extroverted, of course, like we already said, are more outgoing, more talkative. A framework that I really like, a Big Five framework that I like, there are several of them, but one that has a lot of data behind it is called the Big Five Aspects Scale, and it breaks down each dimension, each personality dimension of the 5 into 2 subdimensions or 2 traits. And that's really helpful because it kind of helps you see the 2 sides of the same coin, right? So when we talk about extroversion, we're talking about assertiveness and enthusiasm. Those would be the two subtraits of extroversion. And so someone who is assertive and enthusiastic will tend to be extroverted and will definitely be extroverted in a technical sense. And so you're assertive, you're outgoing, right? You're talkative. And then by the same token, on the enthusiastic side, you're feeling a lot of positive emotions, right?
Yeah.
You're bubbly and things like that. And then on the introversion side, you're more inwardly focused. Maybe you're a little less emotive. Maybe it doesn't necessarily mean you don't feel positive emotions. You just may be less emotive. You're less inclined to seek social interactions. And this is distinctly different from, let's say, shyness or something like that, because it's actually more of a negative emotion, and that's captured by another personality dimension called Neuroticism, which we'll talk about here shortly. But introversion, like most of you intuit, is something along those lines.
Yeah, so Ruben and I are a great example of the two sides of this coin. I scored higher in extroversion. So I was on one side of the spectrum. Ruben was on the other side of the spectrum in more introverted.
Mm-hmm.
I am highly enthusiastic. That is definitely a way that somebody would describe me. And I was raised to be very assertive. And so as a result, I'm going to score high. When you put those two together, I'm going to score high on extroversion.
Yes. And that's a good point you mentioned also, is that you were raised to be more extroverted. And what I find interesting about personality is that it turns out these traits, some more than others, have a biological component, meaning nature.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also have of course, a nurture component. But we tend to think of these traits as being mostly nurture, like environment, but actually there's a lot of evidence that shows that we're born with genes that will manifest as a particular trait.
Right.
And so
dispositions.
Yeah, dispositions, temperaments. So, okay, so I score fairly low in extroversion in pretty much any test I take. And if you look at it through the two subtraits, assertiveness and enthusiasm, actually have a moderate amount of enthusiasm, but the assertiveness end of the spectrum is fairly low. And I never really looked at it like that, but in retrospect, it does explain why some of the first personal development books that I gravitated toward were books like How to Win Friends and Influence People,
Mm-hmm.
which is like a manual on how to be more extroverted, essentially. And another book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. These are books of helping you to be more outgoing, right? And there's a bit of an extrovert ideal in the personal development genre and in kind of society. And Susan Cain talks about this in her book Quiet, which is a book about introverts. But anyway, I do tend to score low there. That manifests as me not seeking out social interactions as much as someone who is higher in extroversion. And I process the world largely through the lens of like kind of thinking about it and not necessarily going out and being in the world,
I think one example that's just easy to understand is, do you feel charged by spending time with people, or do you feel more recharged by spending time at home?
Yeah.
I am a lovely little paradox because I do get recharged spending time at home, but I'm still very enthusiastic and very assertive. So even when I am around people, I'm fairly extroverted, but I do need my me time.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Your extroversion largely comes from, I think, your upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
You grew up in a fairly loud and rambunctious family, and you had to vie for attention in a lot of ways, whereas I didn't. There was a spotlight on me in a lot of my familial interactions. Mm-hmm. And so we've talked about that difference, and I think it's interesting. Another benefit of personality psychology, just a little sidebar here, is being able to appreciate the psychological diversity that exists among people. Yeah, like depending on your upbringing, you may not encounter a person who has a particular trait. Maybe you don't interact with people who are very high in extroversion. That's a possibility, depending on your environment and your culture. And if you run into one of those people, it's like, oh my God, why is this person such an attention-seeking person, And it's like, well, that's actually temperamental. And there's actually a an underlying biological and environmental reason for that. So it's helpful to help put behavior into context, I think, and also on the flip side to help you know how to interact with people.
And for me, I think it's helpful in being more compassionate of others and being more understanding. So these frameworks are, for me, doubly helpful because I can understand myself better, understand, where I want to grow, or give myself credit where credit is due. And then also, like in my coaching practice, or even in just social interactions, giving people the leeway and just because you're not like me, that doesn't mean it's wrong. I think it creates not just tolerance, but acceptance of other people. And we can embrace people who have different temperaments, because we need the whole spectrum. Creates something really nice. Like, it's
definitely
fun to interact with people who are different than you, and understand them makes that way more fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a rainbow. You use the word spectrum, and it's like the spectrum of colors makes the rainbow. And that's true. Actually, our society would be unrecognizable without the spectrum of the different personality traits.
Right.
And so it's important to recognize that. And it helps you to be more self-aware and help you to figure out where you fit in society, what's your niche. It definitely is a tool for being more self-aware and knowing your strengths and weaknesses and helping you kind of chart your career path and other things. So, back to the traits. We're finishing up extroversion here. An example of, just to give you a more concrete example of extroversion, Will Smith, Tony Robbins. These are classic extroverts, Any examples that you can think of off the top of your head?
I think Oprah's pretty extroverted.
Oprah. Ellen DeGeneres, for that matter. If you're on TV and you have a talk show, it's likely you're more extroverted.
Follow Will Smith on Instagram if you don't. And he's an excellent example. He's always surrounded by people, like in every video he posts, and he's obviously really assertive. He posts videos of himself, like, interacting with strangers, and, he's very assertive, and then he's very enthusiastic. So,
yeah.
I think that's a classic, very easy, and he provides a lot of illustrations. He's been very active on Instagram lately.
God, his Instagram has changed the world, I think.
Wow. That's a lot of enthusiasm for someone who's introvert.
That is. But actually, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought up Will Smith, because he's someone that I looked up to, for as long as I can remember. For as long as I knew that he did stuff, I've looked up to him and admired the way he exists in the world and how he carries himself. And something in studying personality psychology that's been really important for me to grasp is that the differences in personality are real, and although you can change certain aspects of your personality, you can improve upon them.
Develop them.
You can develop them, if you will. You can't change into a different person. And so my temperament doesn't allow me to express myself in the way that Will Smith does. And that's okay. It's perfectly fine, because, this is a good point, let's list some examples of well-known introverts. Tim Ferriss, Simon Sinek. If you look at someone like Paulo Coelho, now I'm naming like writers, right? And so you can see how the different career choices are affected by the temperament. And so, is there any other like famous introverts, like obvious examples that I'm missing here?
Obvious examples of introverts. I think Eckhart Tolle would be.
Eckhart Tolle, that's a classic one. He's also someone that I've admired for a long time. It's much more likely that I can express myself in the way that Eckhart Tolle does than in the way Will Smith does. And so that's something to keep in mind. It's like comparing yourself to anybody it's a losing battle.
Totally.
In general. But we all model people, and we all kind of look to people that we admire, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's also important to know how someone is fundamentally different from you, and it's part of self-awareness, I think. Oh, another example of extrovert, Gary Vee. Very high in extroversion.
Oh, yeah.
And I will never give a keynote in the way Gary Vee does, and that for a while kind of bothered me, but in recent years it's It's actually been a comforting thought that I have my own unique skill set and own unique way of manifesting my traits in the world. Wish I could say that more succinctly, but that's the idea. Okay, next dimension, agreeableness. And again, we're not going in order. I'm sorry here. The order is ocean. That's the way to remember it. We're going a little bit out of order because...
I just figured as long as the letters are there, they'll be
the
fine.
letters are there.
You guys are smart. I know that you'll get it.
OCEAN. Okay, we're on the A, agreeableness. Mm-hmm. This is fairly self-explanatory. But in general, agreeable people are easy to get along with. Mm-hmm. They are nice. They're sympathetic. They're empathetic. They're cooperative. They're trusting. Mm-hmm. These are all qualities of agreeable people.
Yep. But what are the two aspects of agreeable?
Aspects of agreeableness are compassion and politeness.
Yes.
And you can kind of see that, these are two sides of the same coin, but they are also distinct traits. And so we can talk about them separately. Compassion, an example that comes to mind is the woman sitting right across from me. You were so high in compassion.
Yeah, I scored like 97% in compassion. So that was real high. And that's a really important thing to know about me, because that can be something, a lot of these things also, something that I think it's important to mention is that a lot of them, she's compassionate. That sounds like it's definitely a good quality trait. But it's important to recognize that scoring so high is kind of extreme. And so even though it sounds like a good quality and it sounds like a great thing, and I'm proud and I'm happy that I'm compassionate, it's something that I have to keep in mind, because I have to be aware that my compassion can let me slip into a habit of not having good boundaries, right? Because I feel so compassionately for people. I'm also what one might call an empath. And so that is a strength, I think. And it's nice to have like that emotional intelligence, and that's wonderful. But also, if you're interacting with people who might toe a boundary or might push through that boundary, then it becomes a liability. It becomes something that I have to be hyper aware of in order to kind of just temper with my assertiveness from my extroversion.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Any of the traits they have positive aspects and negative aspects. Mm-hmm. They have advantages and disadvantages, and that's an important thing to recognize. Some disadvantages are less obvious than others, but that's a really good one you point out to that aspect of agreeableness, the compassion aspect of it. It's like, yeah, you could not have good boundaries, and that could be a problem. So I'm fairly low in compassion, which again doesn't mean that it's the worst thing, and it also doesn't mean that I don't care about people. Obviously, I'm very polite, and so compassion has more to do with sympathy, empathy. People who are compassionate tend to have careers where they help people, nursing, counseling, things like that. I don't have as much rapt attention for people's stories as you do, I guess.
Yeah.
There's really no good way to put that. And my score has varied on this in different tests, but it still comes out on average, fairly low. My politeness, on the other hand, very high. And
record breaking.
It's like 90th percentile, right? Because these are all based in percentiles, which is like your comparison to other people. If I was in a room with 100 people, I would be more polite than 90 of them. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that.
Well, I think you're more polite than I am, but politeness can, again, be something, agreeableness in general, right, can be something that's awesome. Like, oh, you're a really agreeable person. And it can also be a liability. People who are more disagreeable, I think typically they're more in more leadership roles. Yeah. And so, although I think and hope that like that changes, or that is changing, and we can have more agreeable leaders, like I definitely experienced that when I was working in corporate America. But yeah, I think that being polite can have just as much of a liability as being compassionate.
Yeah.
Because you can be polite even if somebody's being very impolite or somebody's testing you. And then, yeah, I want to go back to when you said that I'm more interested in people's stories than you are. And that does come from compassion. But that's also like, will have me crying at videos that you're just like, oh, they're fine. My compassion also triggers guilt issues. And so that is something that you don't have to deal with.
Right. Well, I think I take less ownership of people's problems, I think is what it is.
That is a great way to put it.
That's probably...
#boundaries.
That's probably the best way to put it. Because I care, and I mean, look, I cry at country songs, man. Like, I'll hear certain songs and I will start crying. I do have a good sense of other people's problems and...
separate from your own.
Yeah, of being separate from my own.
Yeah.
And again, that's not obviously a good thing, but... the point is that there's a balance there, right?
Yeah.
It's not good to be one or the other.
Yeah.
Like, it's good to be aware of your trait and then know how to balance it, figure out how to balance it.
And like Ruben and I's partnership, both romantically and in business, it's really helpful that we have these kind of dualities just within our partnership, because I am that person. I've been working in some kind of helping profession for like a decade. And so it's very easy for me to say that, oh, they're only telling me their problem so I can solve it. And then Ruben's very good at being like, that's not our problem. He's still compassionate about it, by the way. But he's just more matter of fact. I think you don't get as caught up in.
My logic goes forefront.
Yes.
Like, so when we're looking at a problem, my logic is at the forefront and your compassion is at the forefront.
Yes.
At the forefront. And so anyway, both are necessary. Both are useful. Some examples of agreeable people. If you guys watch New Girl, Jess in the show New Girl, Jess's character is a great example of someone who's very agreeable. Mm-hmm. Who else?
Oh, Leslie Knope in Parks and Rec, if we're just doing TV. Kenneth in 30 Rock.
Kenneth in 30 Rock. That's true. He's hyper agreeable because he'll do anything anybody asks, basically. And so that's
high in politeness.
Right. So it's obviously like too much.
But I like using either TV or movie examples because people are often caricatures.
Yeah, they're caricatures of real people. And actually that's one like tool of comedy, I think, is the writers will emphasize or exaggerate one dimension of the personality, and it's comedic or it's like sad or something like that, depending on the dimension. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's agreeableness. I'm going to circle back and talk about personal development integrating with this, but I'll say here that the idea of emotional intelligence is probably somewhat encapsulated in agreeableness, in some combination of traits in agreeableness. Totally. There's something there because you're learning how to cooperate with people, how to have compassion for them and their emotions. And that's an important thing to recognize, is that these personality traits, you can start to see the validity of them because you start to look out into the world and you can explain things, and you can also categorize a lot of different information within them. Yeah. So it's very interesting once you start to get into it. Okay, so next on the list is, we'll go with N, neuroticism. Neuroticism, you'll notice that so far these have been, and actually this trait aside, all the other traits are stated in kind of a positive way. Neuroticism is represented with kind of a negative trait. You want to be agreeable, you want to be extroverted, but nobody really wants to be neurotic necessarily. Although we'll talk about the possible benefits there.
And also what we're learning is that you don't always want to be extroverted. You don't always want to be agreeable.
Right.
Like, it's actually, like, even though they're phrased as this is the more positive one, like,
right.
It's helpful to be a little neurotic, says the woman who's a little neurotic.
So neuroticism is essentially a measure of negative emotion. And it's also a measure of your emotional stability or emotional instability, depending on how you want to phrase it.
And what are the two aspects of neuroticism?
So neuroticism, according to the Big Five Aspect Scale, can be fragmented into withdrawal and volatility. So people who are neurotic, they tend to be on the withdrawal side. They tend to be more depressive. And not clinical depression. We're talking about just a more depressive personality leaning toward bouts of loneliness and feeling alone. Mm-hmm. I mean, you definitely could be clinically depressed, but it can also measure healthy negative emotion.
Right. And this whole framework isn't like a diagnosis or like a replacement for anything when it comes to that. It's just talks about tendencies, temperaments.
Exactly. This isn't a way to diagnose mental illness or anything like that. Okay, so on the volatility side of things, you have people who exhibit traits like getting angry very quickly.
For me, my favorite way to think about it is like if you think of a toddler, like a toddler throwing a tantrum.
Right. Neurotic people are, quicker to anger. Mm-hmm. They tend to feel more negative emotion on average. They tend to be more suspicious of others. Things of that nature.
And withdrawal, I think it's like, again, I like to use examples like kind of caricatures. That's what helps me understand it. So when I think about withdrawal, I think about like a teenager slamming the door and going to their room and like wanting to be left alone for the rest of the day. Mm-hmm. Something like that. Yeah.
And so, those are good examples. And I actually don't know the research on when your personality traits actually kind of solidify. Because that teenager may not actually be neurotic. That may just be
a neurotic phase. I think Gretchen Rubin talks about that even with her 4 tendencies and when she's observing her children. Even as teenagers, she's like, oh, some of these are just traits of being a teenager, or some of these are traits of being a child. And it's not until, people are older and they can like do a self-assessment that you can do it with any kind of accuracy. Yeah, exactly. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. Other psychologists will argue that it's like post-pubescence. Our personality's a little bit more solidified.
Yeah. And so in general, neurotic people can, these are the overthinkers often. These are people who tend to see the worst in scenarios at the high end of the neuroticism spectrum. And they tend to be pessimists, that kind of a thing.
And you talked about anger and we talked about sadness, but I think with neuroticism, something else that is, for me, hits more closer to home is like when you said overthinking, like the idea of fear. Like fear.
Mm-hmm. Fear is in there.
Fear is a negative emotion. And I think I, for instance, don't process things through the lens of anger very often. So, but fear is something that like I know very well. And so that's something that I think some people might be able to relate to. Like, oh, if you are having like fear-based thinking, or if your first thought is like, oh, that's a scary thing, or then you can acknowledge, or at least you can identify neurotic tendencies.
Yeah, that's true. And actually it turns out that a lot of personal development books are focused on basically decreasing people's levels of neuroticism.
Yes.
That's kind of what I've realized. And if you look at books like, take the 4 Agreements, for example, you have a framework for how to reframe events and live your life in a way that you can be more mentally at peace. And that's what Eckhart Tolle is doing with his work also. Yep. Anything that's finding inner peace, that's allowing you to reframe events, reshape your beliefs. This is all in an effort to decrease neuroticism.
Right, and Stoicism is another example.
Stoicism, yeah, exactly. That Stoicism in particular works really well with people who tend toward neuroticism because it actually gives you the freedom to negative think a little bit, particularly with things like negative visualization, which is a Stoic technique. You're looking at the worst case scenario and mapping that out to kind of quell your fears a little bit. Mm-hmm. It gives you a little bit of a neurotic outlet while also reframing events so you're more at peace with them.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful also to note that a lot of your work over the past 4 to 5 years with Think Grow Prosper has been in that same vein. It has been in the vein of developing these habits and developing these actions in order to reduce neuroticism. I mean, the Mindset Shifts Masterclass is a program that you developed. The mini course and the masterclass are both like programs that you developed that are really just that. It's like, oh, I see your neuroticism. I see that those tendencies, and let's work on reducing that.
Yeah, that's true. And it turns out that I'm fairly low in neuroticism. And we were talking about this the other day. I don't know if I'm low in neuroticism because I've been working on it for a while, because I've been in personal development for so long, or if that's my natural temperament. I think it's probably a combination of both. I mean, I've never been like quick to anger, but I have had a tendency to overthink for a lot of my life. And you can go through different phases also of where these temperaments are more amplified, where these dimensions are more amplified than others. Like right now, I'm probably in a more of a neurotic phase than I normally have been. Suffice it to say that I've just been overthinking more. I've been a little bit more inclined toward negative emotion, and just a little bit more listless.
I think my hypothesis was that you have those tendencies, like you, perhaps nature-wise, would score higher. You're more, predisposed to be neurotic, and as a result, you were like, "Oh, I'm going to study this, and I'm going to work on it," and that's basically what the genesis of Think Grow Prosper was a result of. And then you got so good. It's like anything. In my past, I was a holistic nutritionist, and like there's this just hilarious thing that we do as humans, which is like we're doing something that works for us. It's like, oh yeah, it's working. Like my knee pain is gone, or like I'm sleeping through the night. And so we stopped doing like the prescriptive thing that was like helping. So it's like, oh, I know I stopped drinking tea at night because I started sleeping well. And then it's like, now I'm not sleeping well anymore. And why is that? And it's because we like achieved the thing that we wanted to achieve. And then we forget about the habits that took us to get there. So I think, but it's nice to record those so we can revisit and reemploy them.
That's very true. I mean, Think Grow Prosper is a good example because Think Grow Prosper was born out of a pretty neurotic phase in my life. Like I was feeling a lot of negative emotions.
And we had a lot of situational things that were happening.
A lot of environmental stress. And so, I was reading a lot of personal development books to decrease my neuroticism, specifically books to decrease my neuroticism. I mean, I didn't frame it like that at the time, but that's what
how do I deal with this difficult
it's like, how do I deal, right? And positive mindsets, like positive thinking, that kind of a thing. But then eventually, as things tend to do, passed, and then I forgot all about my problems, right? And kind of, you're right, forgot to maintain that input of positive material, and got distracted by other things. And so that could definitely be a factor in my increasing neuroticism lately. But it's all under control. Not a big deal. But in general, throughout my life, like I've had a tendency toward positive emotion, thankfully. Okay, so examples of neurotic people, real quick. Someone like Steve Jobs, who's known for kind of being quick to anger and just a little bit aggressive in that regard. That would be one example that comes to mind immediately. Woody Allen actually is a oft-cited example of someone who's neurotic.
I have two TV examples. Cersei Lannister. And BoJack Horseman.
BoJack is a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, BoJack Horseman is a really good one.
Or Rick from Rick and Morty would be another.
Perfect. Yeah, those are two really good examples of neurotic people. That's a good segue into how can neuroticism be positive. It's obvious why low negative emotion would be a good thing, but it's not so obvious how higher negative emotion would be a good thing. But if you're annoyed by things more easily, and especially if you have higher conscientiousness, which we'll get to next, you're going to be compelled to change things. You're going to want to work on things, right? Take action. I mean, like, and that's Steve Jobs is an embodiment of that. It's like he was bothered by the design of something and made it better.
And for instance, people who score really low in neuroticism, right? Those might be people who can be complacent, like, right? If I'm scoring a 0 on neuroticism, I don't feel negative emotions about anything, then it's like, oh, then I'm not bothered to change. Or I don't, this is dirty, like who cares? Like, about cleaning it. And it's kind of like the futility of life embodied by, I don't feel any negative emotions. Like everything is futile. That can also be a thing. So a little neuroticism, A, I think goes a long way, and B, can be helpful.
Yep. Okay, so let's talk about conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is the fourth dimension. It's fragmented into two subtraits. One is industriousness and one is orderliness.
Yes.
But in general, you can think of conscientiousness as the trait that describes people's hard work and level of effort and attention to detail, your resourcefulness, things of that nature. People who are on the industrious side of things, they're resourceful. They're scrappy. They know how to make something out of nothing. These are people who can stick to a schedule and who like sticking to a schedule and who are accountable.
I also, showing initiative, I think, is a big one. Like, if you're industrious, not only are you showing up every day, not only are you working hard every day, but you're also showing initiative.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the orderly side of things, people who are orderly like things tidy. You can tell immediately someone's orderliness by their space, like their room.
Ruben scores higher in orderliness than I do. So one of my favorite things to do is we work from home. We both have offices and separate rooms, separate offices. And I like to show people Ruben's office first because it is quite orderly, and then show them mine, which is, less so.
Yeah, I'll be in the kitchen and I'll know Vanessa's been in the kitchen because all the cabinets are open. It's very funny. But I don't even think about it anymore. I just shut all the cabinets and put away all the...
Go on.
And put away all the spice jars and stuff. Anyway.
We're going to crop that out.
Yeah, we are.
Oof.
Definitely. So, conscientiousness is interesting because it is the greatest predictor out of all the big five. It is the greatest predictor of personal and career success, right? If you're conscientious and you're paying attention to things, you're thoughtful about how you approach things, you're going to have more success, right? That's if you really look at it from that angle, it's fairly obvious, but statistically, it's also true. Examples of people who are conscientious. I like The Rock as an example because, you see him all the time in the gym, and I know this is part of his brand, but I really believe this is also part of his personality. He's just a very hardworking person, and he's he's industrious. He came up from fairly humble beginnings, and he's just always working in a very efficient and effective manner. It's one thing to be always working, but spinning your wheels. But it's another thing to be working in an effective manner. And a lot of these people who are in high-level positions and whose name tend to be conscientious. Like Jeff Bezos, like Steve Jobs, obviously, Bill Gates. These are quintessential examples of people extremely high in conscientiousness.
Right.
You can kind of close your eyes and point to someone in the business world who is conscientious.
So it's industrious, and what was the other aspect?
Industriousness and orderliness.
Orderliness.
Okay, well, example of the orderliness trait would be someone like Monica from Friends.
Totally. Classic.
Very orderly, doesn't like anything to be out of place.
I think you see this on, with celebrities. I think their orderliness is often something that we get shown. We get shown oh, look at this super organized closet, or the super organized kitchen, or this look at how scheduled to a T they are. You can't do something out of order. And so I think we see a lot of that. We see, at least celebrities' orderliness is something that magazines find interesting, or that we see highlighted when we're trying to get shown their personality. And then industriousness is typically if you know who someone is, it's because they've worked really, really hard. And I think that you have that in more interviews. Tiffany Haddish, she did an interview with Jada Pinkett Smith on the Red Table, and she talks about, I've been doing this for 20 years. People think that you just come up, and I've been working really hard at this for 20 years consistently. And so that's the very impressive part of conscientiousness. It's oh, you're not just showing up one day or 2 days. You are continuing to show up.
Exactly.
And I do like that, when we talked about how personal development is honing or developing these personality traits, conscientiousness is, I think, a huge one. That's one of the biggest ones besides neuroticism that readers, followers of TGP will ask for. How do you do this every day? How do you, discipline, right? People talk about the word discipline, and that would fall into conscientiousness.
Yeah, this is another huge subgenre for personal development. like most business books are about how to be more conscientious, basically.
And money management books.
And money management books too. So if you look at someone like Dave Ramsey, who tells you how to manage your money, conscientious people are better at managing their money. Mm-hmm. And so that's what he's doing. He's helping you be more conscientious in the money space. If you look at something like The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy, this is how to, how small things can make a big difference over time, how to develop better habits. Anything in that domain is going to be how to increase your conscientiousness. And so there's a whole bunch of books in this category, and rightly so, because it is, like we said, it's a big predictor of success.
Right. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think that's like a huge one.
Huge one.
I think the shortcut, right, the hack for conscientiousness is like finding out your why. Like if you have and what motivation, right? So motivation would fall under conscious. How do you stay motivated? How do you stay disciplined? Like, and it's like, what is your why? If you have a carrot that's big enough or meaningful enough, then you'll continue to be industrious. Then you'll continue to be conscientious about that. Yeah,
and people who are conscientious are better at setting goals and achieving them.
Yep.
And so if you're lower in conscientiousness, you may not even be able to set goals. And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah.
But recognizing that you're lower in conscientiousness is an important starting point, because then you can kind of seek out information that will help you to increase this trait.
Yeah. And I think it's like anything, like recognizing that you're in a space, because just so we talked about neuroticism, I think conscientiousness is something that you can have seasons of also. Yeah. Like if you experience a failure, experience a setback, or maybe you're going through like a life change, you might feel demotivated, like what your carrot was has shifted. What are you working towards? But knowing that that's a season, and then, redeveloping your why and getting motivated, that's the sweet spot. I mean, that's where personality psychology meets personal development.
There you go.
Boom.
And I don't know if we're spending enough time on the other end of the spectrum of each of these traits, but I think it's worth noting the person lower in conscientiousness will not be as concerned with setting goals or working hard or being orderly or any of these kind of characteristics. They're going to be viewed as more lazy by other people. They're going to be viewed as unorganized, that kind of a thing on the very low end of the spectrum.
Right. And I think, again, being extremely industrious, that isn't always great, right? But also being incredibly disorderly is also not always great.
Well, the extreme end of the spectrum, you could be so driven, to the exclusion of other things, right? So if you're so driven, that could consume you.
Right. And or so orderly that consumes you.
So orderly, on the extreme end of the spectrum, you have disorders, right? You have personality disorders. On the other end, of course, you're like I said, you're going to be lazy, you're not going to be motivated, anything like that. And so, and actually a good example of this is an interesting example in real life. We watched the show Queer Eye. And in there, it's a whole makeover show, right?
Right.
And so they're taking people, mostly men, who basically are low in conscientiousness and helping them to straighten out their lives. But what's interesting is that one of the first things they do is they clean up their room.
Yes.
And they help them organize their space. And so that shows the direct link there between like being self-sufficient, organizing your stuff, and actually doing stuff in the world, and actually being a productive member of society. So, and then they also tidy up their actual wardrobe and they groom themselves. And so these are all aspects of conscientiousness, kind of,
Right.
And then they give them some motivation, and these people transform before your eyes. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's an excellent show if you haven't watched it. But I think that's true. It's kind of like what you were talking about last week. Or last podcast episode, like act like you want to become, fake it till you make it. So they're like, oh, you look like an orderly person. Your house looks like you're very conscientious. It's like very tidy. And then Karamo hits up like pain points, right? Which is like what will continue to happen if you like live this way, and okay, what motivates you to like change, and that. He's establishing their carrot, establishing their why, and then giving them the motivation. And that's kind of the arc of the show.
Yeah.
Of every episode.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Spoiler.
Okay, so that was conscientiousness.
Yes.
And now we are on to the last trait, the fifth trait, which is openness to experience. This is one of my favorite dimensions. So openness to experience is essentially a measure of, well, two things. Technically, it's looking at your intellect, and then it's looking at your openness. And these are, particularly in this dimension, these are kind of more technical terms. So intellect isn't exactly IQ or intelligence, but intellect would be something like your interest in ideas, your interest in thinking abstractly and about philosophy and things like that, watching documentaries, that kind of a thing, researching. And then on the creativity side of it, that's described by openness. And the term openness is different from openness to experience. Openness would be one aspect of openness to experience. And that's a synonym for that would be something like creativity. So you have your creativity and your intellect. And on the creativity side of it, you have people like poets and artists and makers of all kinds, people who want to create things and people who are interested in that kind of a thing.
Right. And I think that's important that you know, because it's not just, these makers, it's people who are interested in that too. Like people who appreciate creativity. So you don't have to express yourself creatively in order to appreciate creativity. Right.
So if one of the things you like to do when you visit a new city is go to a museum, you're likely high in openness. If you like to read poetry, you're likely higher in openness. If you like to make things, if you like to even doodle in your spare time, these kind of things are indicators of openness to experience. Yeah, people who are high in openness, they're also just open to other ideas. And some measurements include openness to emotion, which I think is interesting. But people who are interested in other cultures and other ideas and other ways of doing things are high in openness. And many, like Hollywood people, are very high in openness. Celebrities, actors, actresses, very high in openness to experience, right? Like very open to new ideas. The profession selects for that trait almost because people who are interested in theater become actors.
Right, or they're expressing themselves creatively. But I think even people whose main hobby is traveling or who do seek out, learning about other cultures. So Ruben scored very high in intellect.
Yeah, but we're both pretty high in openness to experience overall. I think we're similar in intellect and also in openness.
Yeah, you scored, I think, a little higher because Ruben, has Stephen Hawking books in his office and Leonardo da Vinci 1,000-page tomes in here. And so, he is a little bit more open to ideas than I am in thinking about these less concrete ideas.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So on the intellect side of things, I'm interested in ideas. And if you've ever wanted to play devil's advocate or do a thought experiment, these are indicators of being high in intellect and openness to experience. She's rolling her eyes right now because she's not into that.
Right. I love it. It's great. I just don't love it as much. But yeah, if you're interested in doing thought experiments, let's just talk about this, this thing for fun, then I don't do that as often as you do.
But ultimately, we're both very high in openness, which is just a general openness to new things.
And I think that's a good example of showing how we manifest things in different ways.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't study psychology. But my high compassion makes the things that I study be more people-based. I'd rather read an autobiography or a fiction book than...
I was just going to say that.
Read about physics or the space-time continuum.
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually very similar if you look at it that way. You've read hundreds of more fiction books than I have and probably consumed a similar amount of ideas, but they were based in people's stories. And so because of that tickled your compassion trait, and so you're able to consume that more easily. Right,
and you are more interested in science. Your lack of compassion, but where our interests, I think, intersect is one of my majors was anthropology, and Ruben has been really into anthropology and evolutionary biology as of late, and so we've been able to connect on that because I like the people part of people evolving, and he likes the evolution part of people evolving.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so let's give some examples of people who are high in openness to experience. Like I said, a lot of actors. I think we already kind of went over this.
Okay, well, we can do Anthony, since we just talked about Queer Eye. Anthony from Queer Eye. is willing to eat and or smell anything in anybody's refrigerator.
That's true. Culinary adventurousness is also an indicator of high openness.
Yes, culinary adventurousness.
That's true. So, I mean, all those guys are pretty open. I think
Anthony Bourdain.
Anthony Bourdain, rest in peace. Other people high in openness. I mean, you mentioned Leonardo da Vinci. I have his books, I have his autobiography, and I have a collection of his paintings. He is probably the quintessential example of someone who was high in openness to experience. I mean, he was interested in all kinds of ideas, as evidenced by his elaborate notebook, and then he also created a bunch of stuff, and he was very creative.
Yeah.
And interested in a whole bunch of different domains, too. He had a wide variety of interests. So I think that should give you a good example of someone who's high in openness to experience.
For another TV example, Tyrion Lannister.
I think Tyrion's a little...
Game of Thrones.
And and particularly his intellect, right? So he's interested in ideas.
Right. He would read a lot, very interested. And then also interested in, like, observing or experiencing the application of those ideas.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I've read about this. I'd like to see it in person.
Yep. Very true. Very true. Okay, so I want to end this episode
Period. Goodbye.
I want to end this episode with a little summary of how this ties into personal development. How does this help you? You may be wondering. How does this apply to personal development or bettering myself at all? And the answer is that what I've realized is personal development, the field of personal development, and in fact, actually, I haven't thought through this fully, but I think pretty much any book you could name that's giving you any sort of advice, possibly any book at all, is somehow trying to improve one or more aspects of your personality. So you can look at it through the Big Five framework, and I've actually done this with a few books, but you could go like, okay, pick an aspect. We just talked about openness to experience. Okay, so if you're low in openness to experience and you're not into other ideas and other people's way of being scares you and that kind of a thing, well, you might identify this and you may go, okay, well, this is holding me back in some way. And if you've identified that, that's part of self-awareness, and that's a big thing. And that's a big benefit of being aware of these personality dimensions. But what do? Well, you can seek out books and information that help you increase your openness to experience. And books in this domain would be things based around creativity. I mean, one of my favorite books is Show Your Work by Austin Kleon. His other book, Steal Like an Artist. These are books, with
The Artist's Way.
The Artist's Way, right. By Julia Cameron. That's a classic book. These are books that are dealing with and helping you improve this dimension of your personality. They don't explicitly say that, obviously, because they're not personality psychology books, but I'm just kind of connecting these dots here. And we can do this with other traits. Like we mentioned conscientiousness too. Like if you look at books like we mentioned The Compound Effect, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and if you identify yourself as lower in conscientiousness, and by the way you do that is you look at your results and you look at your behavior and go, okay, am I actually setting goals? Like, am I sticking to a consistent schedule? These kind of things, you know? And you realize you're not, you can seek out books that are working on that trait. Extroversion, you're looking at books that help you deal with people better and help you to be more outgoing, how to win friends, influence people. On the other side of that, you have books that help you be a better introvert, like Quiet by Susan Cain, which is one of my favorite books. Agreeableness, we talked about emotional intelligence. And Neuroticism, you have books like How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie. Feel the fear and do it anyway. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a really good tool for decreasing one's neuroticism. And you can read a book called Feeling Good by David Burns. That's a very good book that deals with cognitive behavioral therapy. But the point is that these books basically target one primary dimension and help you improve upon it, which I think is so fascinating because this is where personal development and personality frameworks come together. Right. And you can use the personality framework to, one, assess where you are and assess your different personality traits and how you score on them. And then subsequently, you can go, okay, well, what do I need to work on and what's holding me back? and identify the things that are holding you back, and then seek out those books. And this will help you, yes, increase those traits that you need to work on, but it will also help you from spending time on areas of yourself that you don't need to spend time on.
Totally.
If you're a very conscientious person and you're already like doing all the things necessary to like stay on the road to success, hard work, industriousness, orderliness, maybe you don't need to read as much of The Power of Habit as you do another dimension that you need to work on, right?
And also, I think self-knowledge for me as stands alone. Like stands alone it's very helpful. You know, you talked about, I think in a different podcast episode. I think I was on it. It was our Ask Me Anything. And you talked about confidence being self-knowledge, like knowing who you are and being okay with it, right? So, but part of that is like, I'm not comparing myself to other people. So just knowing that I'm more introverted than others can give me confidence. So self-knowledge stands alone as a super helpful way to build confidence, to have better relationships. You and I have used this framework as a shorthand for our relationship when we have differences of opinion. It's like, I'm like this because, or I believe this because of this tendency of mine. Yeah. And it's served as like a different language, another level in which we can understand each other. But then now, I think when you connect the two and you have this, you create a bridge and you say, now you can choose your own adventure. Now you can say, you know, like that recipe that we were talking about at the beginning, we can say, hey, I want to dial down the sweetness. I want to be less polite. I want to be more assertive. I want to, do this because it's going to help me reach my goals. And you can have a targeted, whether you're reading books or you're consuming podcasts or you're working with a mentor or a coach, you have a targeted, much more laser focus way to achieve things. And so I think when we work in this really broad way, it's not as effective as if we're like, I want to do this and I want to have actionable steps. So how am I going to measure that I'm becoming more assertive? What practices am I going to do? And then you are able to see how that affects your life as a whole.
Yep. Exactly. Well put. So I'm going to put links in the show notes to this episode for some of the books we talked about here, and also links to where you can take your own personality assessment. And also I'm going to link back to the original blog post I wrote about this as a reference, so you can kind of look up the different dimensions, and if you have any questions, you can refer back to that blog post. I will link all the relevant info in the show notes to this episode, and you can get that on my website, thinkgrowprosper.com. This was fun.
This was really fun. Also, if you wanted to pick up any of the books that we already talked about, and that we're going to link on the website, if you wanted to listen to them in the same way that you do these podcasts, our good friends over at Audible are more than happy to give all Think Grow podcast listeners a free book and month trial of Audible. And so it's basically you can listen to the audiobooks, you can listen to it at 2x or 1.5x. It's an efficient way to listen to books. I know Ruben uses it constantly. And to access the free Audible trial, it's audibletrial.com/TGP.
audibletrial.com/TGP. Yeah, that link will be in there along with the blog post, along with the links to take your own personality assessment and anything else we talked about.
Various other things.
Okay, so keep looking out for that. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode of the Think Grow podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, follow us on various social medias, and let us know. Good night.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Think Grow podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and find value in this podcast, I humbly ask you to please subscribe or leave me a review on iTunes. Or you can just share it with a friend who you think might find value in it. If you've already done any of these, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you. I truly, truly appreciate your support. Lastly, if you have any suggestions for future guests or topics you'd like to hear covered, you can email podcast@thinkgrowprosper.org.